I'm here with Brion Oakes, who's the Chief Equity Officer in Austin. Brion, thank you so much for coming here and joining us for this conversation. So equity officers, I feel like a growing number of cities are really trying to be intentional about how they look at equity. Could you talk a little bit about your position and what it actually entails and why it's so important?
So I am the first Chief Equity Officer for the city of Austin, and I came on board in October of last year, and it was a combination of things that were really happening in our community that really led the city to go into this direction. One of the initial things that happened was that there was an organization called the Martin Prosperity Institute that came out of a report in 2015, which listed Austin as the most economically segregated city in the United States. And at the same time, we had a number of different local grassroots community organizations really sort of advocating and pressing the city to address serious issues of inequities that we had. And that actually led our mayor and our city council to pass a resolution requiring our city manager to really sort of look at this issue of systemic inequity that we had as a city, but to also begin to put tools in place that could help us make better decisions as a city as it resulted to driving better equitable outcomes overall.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the sort of buckets, I guess, that come under the idea of equity is housing, right? And housing inequalities have really been institutional for a really long period of time in the history of American cities. How are you approaching that? And particularly, what are the challenges that you're facing, let's say on the east side of Austin, where there's a lot of changes going on?
So affordable housing is such a complex issue for Austin to deal with, but I also think many urban areas are dealing with the challenges of affordability. In Austin, we've definitely seen the cost of real estate increase significantly over the last 10 years. And we also realize that we have some real challenges in terms of many families being displaced because they can just no longer afford to live in the neighborhoods that traditionally lived in. And so as a city, I think we have to look at all the different options that we have. We have to be intentional about looking at some of the things that we do as a city and how those policies or actions may actually increase or speed up the rate of gentrification and displacement. And then we also need to sort of figure out what are our strategies, our policy opportunities that we have to actually preserve the current affordable housing that we have. And I think it's really by looking at tackling the issue on both ends. Do you really sort of have the opportunity to make a dent or make headway into really sort of solving this very complex issue around affordable housing, right? Some of the things that our city is doing right now is that we have a process that we're going through to revise our land use code, and it's called Code Next. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is that we're going to be working with our Code Next team to actually sort of do a racial equity assessment around Code Next and our land use policies to really sort of be able to help provide more clarity around the different things that actually can improve affordability of our neighborhoods, or look at the things that we feel could actually have a negative unintended consequence that could actually further the displacement. And so for me, it's almost like a process of prevention, right? So the more that we can sort of reveal or provide clarity around things, it gives us more opportunity to act and respond as a city to sort of prevent these things from happening in the first place.
I also wanted to talk about, because the other aspect of equity is transit access. And it's one that has only, I think, recently come to surface as an important it's a civil rights issue, right? I mean, historically, a lot of neighborhoods that have been African American or Latino neighborhoods have not got the same access to transit. And that has affected, that has real world consequences for jobs, for economic opportunities, health. And so how are you thinking about approaching transit with an equity lens?
So there's two best practices that we're really trying to bring to the city of Austin and the departments that we're working with. And so one of those sort of mantras is that we want our departments to know the history, especially know the history as it relates to racism and around sort of racial equity. And I think that that's the first step to really being able to address these issues head on. The second one is that we need really good disaggregated data so that we can begin to understand how communities are impacted, especially communities of color are impacted. And so I think from a transportation standpoint, in Austin in particular, we know we have challenges that as we sort of displace more families to the outer regions of the city, we know that transportation costs go up for those families, which is the opposite thing of what we really want to happen from an affordability perspective. So for us, it really sort of begins with this whole dialogue around knowing the history and understanding the data so that we can begin to actually make better decisions as a city to really sort of address those issues for the community, essentially.
I think we sort of touched on this because I think it does really figure into the questions I've asked you about housing and transit is the question of health, public health. And I believe you've had a lot of background with looking at health disparities. What does that landscape look like in Austin in terms of what public health inequalities look like, and what are some solutions that you've learned in your own experience? So
for us, with the City of Austin, we have some significant and serious challenges as it relates to health disparities. But one of the things I think that's critical in the public health space is that we know that a lot of the health outcomes and life expectancy that we see for different neighborhoods or communities within a city are so much determined by what we call are those social determinants of health. And so, so what's really exciting for me is that coming from a public health background and doing a lot of work with the American Heart Association for many years looking at health equity issues, was leading us into this area of saying, if you don't have really good built environments and you address issues like transportation and affordable housing and all those other sort of infrastructure, quality of sidewalks, all those things actually feed into the health outcomes that we see. And so we think that this work that we're doing across the whole city being focused on equity should actually help us sort of close the gap on some of the health disparities that we see, and we should be building overall a healthier and a stronger community as we move forward, because there's all interconnected with each other. Right. Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. I think it's an important one. Thank you.